For the majority of early Tudor history, Spain and England had remained on friendly terms. The Treaty of Medina del Campo, the marriage of Catherine of Aragon with Henry VIII, and their hatred for the French had united the kingdoms for mutual benefit. This alliance continued to prosper when Philip II and Elizabeth's sister, Queen Mary I, married in 1554 and embarked on a romantic war against the French until 1559. After Mary's death, Elizabeth ascended to the throne and, at first, maintained amicable relations with Philip. He even convinced the Pope not to excommunicate Elizabeth in 1558. However, if we fast forward to 1585, the two former allies had begun a resentful war across the seas and oceans. So, how did we get to this point? Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, abdicated in 1555, dividing his territories among his sons. Ferdinand became Holy Roman Emperor, while Philip became King of Spain, inheriting territories in Italy, the New World, and the Habsburg lands in the Netherlands. These Dutch territories became the focal point of the outbreak of war and the creation of the Spanish Armada. As we mentioned in the last episode, the Netherlands was essential to the English economy, being England's primary trade partner for the growing export of wool. Additionally, the Netherlands was strategically important, as a continental army could be sent from the port of Antwerp in a mere day to invade England at any time. When Charles V ruled these territories, they were allowed considerable self-government. However, when Philip II took over in 1556, he opted for a hands-on approach as anti-Catholic sentiment grew in the area. The outbreak of Protestant Dutch resistance to Catholics in 1566 and subsequent embargoes severely damaged both the English and Dutch economies and Spanish-Anglo relations, as Elizabeth was uneased when a Spanish army of 10,000 soldiers, which later grew to 50,000, landed in the Netherlands to control the revolt, as this was seen as a national security threat to England. Yet, Elizabeth was hesitant about this war, as it would break her fundamental policy of straying away from foreign continental conflict. Also, common opinion at the time associated war with manly leaders such as Henry VIII, so their overspending was often ignored or even encouraged. But if Elizabeth was to have an expensive war, the reactions would be pretty negative, and maybe even lead to revolution. But as we already know, the war started in 1585. So let's take a look at the 7 reasons that pushed Elizabeth to declare war on her ex-brother-in-law Philip II and England's old ally. First, religion. You probably already know this one if you've seen episode 2, but Elizabeth was a Protestant, and so was England after her religious settlements, and Philip and Spain were a deeply Catholic nation. Therefore, both saw each other's religion as wrong and as a threat to their national security. But if we were to ask Philip himself what he resented most about Elizabeth, he would probably mention another reason, as, after the death of Elizabeth's sister and Philip's wife, Mary I, he hoped to maintain his influence in England and remain in the family by marrying Elizabeth. However, he was painfully rejected, fostering bitterness towards Elizabeth and the English royal family. In the 1560s, as trade became increasingly common throughout the New World, several attacks occurred across the Atlantic, mostly incited by English ships on the Spanish. Cambridge historian Richard Rex describes these as the marine equivalent of border incidents, as the English attempted to assert themselves throughout the world's oceans. These conflicts, which could easily be described as an act of piracy, escalated throughout the end of the 16th century, with English sailors such as Hawkins and Drake targeting and stealing treasures from the Spanish ships in the New World. Surprisingly, Elizabeth also participated in these acts of piracy. In 1568, she ordered the seizure of a Spanish ship stationed in Southampton destined to the Netherlands. This ship was crucial for the Spanish, as it was carrying a loan from Italian bankers that hoped to support the Spanish struggle in the area. But Elizabeth played the cards right, claiming that since the ship hadn't technically reached the Netherlands, she was stealing from the Italians and not the Spanish, and thus adopting an anti-papal stance rather than directly attacking Philip and his efforts. These attacks were mostly driven by easy financial gain, but significantly and needlessly escalated tensions between England and Spain. Philip was furious, as from his point of view, Elizabeth encouraged, participated, and rewarded this behavior, leading him to involve himself in English internal struggles. But first, in 1580, Philip would get a significant boost, as the list of successors for the Portuguese throne was in a critical situation. The lucky and opportunistic Philip, whose mother was Portuguese, took advantage of the situation, claiming the throne and, after a small scuffle, incorporated Portugal into his empire. This created the most powerful and extensive empire the world had ever seen, making him the richest and most powerful man in the world. With this vast power also came vast ambitions, and a Catholic England was one of them. The arrival of Mary Queen of Scots, a Catholic contender of Elizabeth, in 1568 allowed Philip the perfect opportunity to stick his nose in English affairs and attempt to dethrone Elizabeth from his palace in El Escorial. We went through all these plots in detail in episode 3, but if you remember, Philip attempted to support plots to restore Catholicism in England, as there is evidence that he aided, financed, and supported the 1571 Ridolfi plot, the 1583 Throckmorton plot, and the 1586 Babington plot. When Mary Queen of Scots was assassinated in 1587, Philip lost his legitimate option to dethrone Elizabeth without armed conflict. With France's civil war, they were no longer a threat, and England and Spain, the traditional enemies of the French, now found their historic alliance unnecessary. Although some of Elizabeth's advisors entertained the notion of a French-British alliance against the Spanish, as the Dutch conflict impacted the national security of both England and France, Elizabeth never took this idea seriously. After a lot of hesitation, Elizabeth finally moved the first pawn, induced by the rebels' loss of Antwerp, which placed England directly in sight of a Spanish invasion. In 1585, the Earl of Leicester led an army of 6,000 men to support the Dutch rebels against Philip II. Elizabeth had fully committed to the war. However, the Earl of Leicester proved to be an inept military commander, having no real experience in continental warfare, but it was enough to slow down Spanish armies in the Netherlands. At first, Philip also hesitated, as he hoped to avoid direct conflict with England. His focus was instead on defeating and expelling the Muslim navies and armies of the Mediterranean and taking full military and religious control of his Dutch territories. Yet, Elizabeth's bold move to side with the Dutch rebels proved too much for Philip, who gave instructions to start building the largest fleet ever seen in Europe, also known as the Spanish Armada. Philip, who probably jinxed it, called it La Armada Invencible, or the Invincible Armada, as hopes and motivations were over the roof to invade England and finally restore Catholicism. Preparations for the attack occupied most of 1587, but were set back by Francis Drake, who raided Cadiz that same year. Yet, ignoring the initial sign, Philip decided to send 130 ships and around 20,000 men across the English Channel to meet up with 27,000 more men to invade England. Before we begin talking about the events that unfolded, I wanted to clarify that these have been very debated, dramatized, and romanticized by both British and Spanish historians. I've attempted to use sources from both sides to try and give you the real events of how it all went down. When the Spanish Armada left the port of Lisbon on May 28th, it was met by its major rival, the weather, as they had to stop their trip to seek refuge in Galicia. The Armada regrouped and set sail to the English Channel again, and when on July 19th, word came that the Armada had been sighted, Elizabeth was petrified, as, although the British did have the defensive advantage and remarkable experience fighting in the sea, if the Spanish were to successfully land on the English shores, the Spanish army, way more experienced in continental warfare, would have probably overrun the weak inland defenses and possibly conquer England. The initial expedition throughout the English Channel was actually going quite well. The strongholds of the Spanish ships and their tight formation were a sight to behold, and Philip thought that this would be enough, as he believed that the presence of such a large fleet would be sufficient to force Elizabeth into peace. But oh boy, was he wrong. Some historians agree that the battle was lost even before it started, due to the lack of shelter and treacherous waters. Despite having a chance to attack the English under favorable conditions, the Spanish command stuck to the initial plan. The English fleet positioned itself behind the Spanish, and on July 31st, 1588, began attacking them, but from a distance, as the English avoided close combat as they were inferior and would rather use their long-range cannons. This was 9 days of combat that would decide the whole conflict, as the English knew that if the Spanish Armada reached the Flemish coast, the campaign would be lost. Yet, the Armada persisted. The English Channel, which is shaped like a funnel, forced the Spanish forward, and the strong winds, combined with long-range attacks, hindered any Spanish attempt to land in England. Anyways, the fleet still needed to pick up their forces waiting in Dutch territories, so on July 27th, the Spanish decided to anchor in Gravelines, near Calais. This left the Armada vulnerable and packed together, marking a decisive moment in the battle. The English command made a desperate but brilliant decision, sending fireships filled with anything that would burn, including gunpowder, towards the Armada. The results were devastating for the Spanish, who had to quickly cut their anchors and flee to avoid losing their entire fleet. After another battle, the winds forced the Spanish to return by navigating around the British Isles, where the forces of nature delivered the final blow to Philip's hopeful plan. This 40-day voyage was horrible and destroyed a portion of the Armada, as the harsh storms of the Scottish and Irish coasts caused several shipwrecks. But still, a surprising amount of boats returned to the port of Santander. Many English people believed that the Invincible Armada had been defeated by the wrath of God. Elizabeth's image was now remembered in a romantic and perfect light, as she was hailed as the savior of her people. Many stories of the conflict end here, but the attack of 1588 was not the only attempt at seaborne attacks during the war. Francis Drake attempted to launch a naval attack on Spain to fully destroy their fleet once and for all, with a fleet larger than the Spanish Armada itself. But instead, this attack suffered the greatest naval catastrophe in English history. Combat was also seen in the New World, as the so-called Elizabethan sea dogs continued to disrupt Spanish colonial trade. The war was still ongoing when Elizabeth died after a short illness on March 24, 1603, at the age of 69. By the time of her death, English involvement in the war was seen as a success, as she was able to withhold her main foreign policy objective of national security. So, that's it. I'll include a couple of past paper questions to finish the video, so make sure to see if you can answer the questions comfortably. If not, rewatch the video. Thanks for watching, and good luck.